my XP machine has a bit of an issue. And that's just while idling on the desktop. Now, when I built this machine, I used very high-end parts from late 2006 and 2007, as that's just the time period of hardware that I really wanted to build in. However, going with high-end parts came at the cost of high-end power consumption, and thus heat generation. There were times last summer where I legitimately could not use the system without opening up a window first. It got that hot in here. And that was in the evening. Like, I didn't even attempt to really use this thing during the day. It was suicide to do that. And cranking up the AC to solve this issue is not really solving anything. So I need to actually address this problem, especially before summer rolls around again, because you know, I'd like to use the machine. Even turning the CPU down to its stock clock speeds didn't really help the issue. After all, the system does still have two NVIDIA 8800 GTXs in SLI, so fundamentally something has to change here. But the issue is, I really love this hardware. I love Intel's Core 2s and NVIDIA's Tesla architecture. I don't want to just give that up. Now, if only there was a way to have the same hardware with the same level of performance while using a lot less power. Luckily for me, both Intel and NVIDIA did just that. Take this hardware and build it on smaller and newer nodes, thus reducing power consumption and basically having the same performance, if not increasing it. Especially NVIDIA. They did that a lot. We'll talk about that. Let's tackle the CPU first. The Core 2 Extreme QX6700 I have in here now was quite the chip back when it launched in 2006. Built on a 65nm process and using the Conroe-derived Kentsfield architecture, its game-changing new quad-core design instantly made it one of the best CPUs money could buy. This, however, was pretty short-lived, as just a couple months later, Intel would release the vastly more popular Core 2 Quad Q6600. While it didn't have an unlocked multiplier and was a bit slower, it was way cheaper and far more accessible, while still having great overclocking potential, and as a result of this, it's gone down as one of the most legendary CPUs of all time. So I'm going with a Q6600 then? Well, no. First of all, it's still built on the same 65nm node as the Extreme, and especially if I overclocked it, there wouldn't be a huge difference between it and the Extreme, which would defeat the whole point. So that's why I'll be going for a much newer Core 2 Duo E8600, which I happen to already have lying around. Wait, a dual core? Not a quad core? While the quad cores were very exciting at the time for a variety of reasons, truth be told, it didn't have a big impact on games of the time. Most games still preferred a high-clocked dual-core, and while you could get this from an overclocked Core 2 Quad and have the best of both worlds, that doesn't really matter to me since I'm mostly just playing games on the system and I don't really care about productivity or multitasking. The E8600 happens to be one of the fastest Core 2 Duos Intel released, clocking in at 3.33 GHz on a 1333 megatransfer frontside bus, which just so happens to be the same as the overclock I've been running on the Core 2 Extreme, so this should make for a pretty interesting comparison. The E8600 is built on the newer 45nm process and is using the Wolfdale architecture. The newer process, combined with the fact it has 2 less cores, should translate to a significant reduction in power consumption. Plus, the newer design brings along 6 MB of L2 cache instead of the 4 MB per die setup of the Extreme, which may make it slightly faster in single-threaded performance. But of course, you know I just have to try overclocking it as well. I hope to be able to hit 4 GHz with it, which may be a bit optimistic considering N-Force boards can be kind of finicky, but I think it should be doable. Overclocking is obviously going to negate some of the power savings, but it still has 2 less cores and the newer manufacturing process, so I think the savings will still be significant even with an overclock. Now for the GPUs. I could just go with a single card. That would obviously be a massive reduction in power consumption and would help quite a bit with my goal here, but I'm kind of losing the spirit of the build. The whole spirit of the build is overkill, SLI. You know, I can't just get rid of that. So I went out of my way to buy a second XFX GTS 250 to complement the one that I already had. GTS 250, how is that related to the 8800 GTXs? Well, it's a complicated story, so let's go over that real quick.
NVIDIA's Tesla architecture begins with the legendary G80, which powered cards like the 8800 GTX and 8800 Ultra. While there were cut-down versions and derivatives which powered the 8800 GTS and other lower-end cards, the full-fat G80 was a very impressive piece of silicon when it launched back in late 2006. With 128 unified shaders, 32 TMUs, 24 ROPs, a 384-bit memory bus, and DirectX 10 support, with a core clock of 576 MHz and a shader clock of 1350, yes, those were clocked separately on this architecture, it was nothing short of a powerhouse with almost nothing else on the market standing much of a chance against it. There was only really one issue with it, and that's that it was built on a 90nm node. Now, there's nothing wrong with 90nm, but a chip this large built on 90nm is going to suck back some serious power. Plus, it was very expensive for NVIDIA to produce, which resulted in its $599 launch MSRP. NVIDIA knew it needed to bring down manufacturing costs, along with the power consumption. So in 2007, NVIDIA took G80 and gave it a complete refresh with G92. When G92 launched with the 8800 GT, it was cut down a bit from the G80, dropping down to 112 shaders, only 16 ROPs, and the memory bus was cut down to 256 bits wide. But it did gain a healthy boost in the TMU count to 56, and the clock speed was bumped up to 600 MHz and the shader clock to 1500. This setup kept most of the performance from the 8800 GTX, but critically, G92 was built on TSMC's 65nm process. This significantly cut down on power consumption, and the smaller die size made it much cheaper to produce. Cheap enough that NVIDIA was able to price the 8800 GT at just $249, which made it immensely popular. A few months later in 2007, NVIDIA released the 8800 GTS 512, which featured a fully equipped G92, now with 128 shaders, just like the G80, and 64 TMUs. It also had its core clock raised to 650 MHz and the shader clock to 1625. So far, so good, right? Well, NVIDIA sure thought so. In 2008, NVIDIA would take the 8800 GT and 8800 GTS 512 and would rebrand them as the 9800 GT and 9800 GTX, respectively. This brought with it a price reduction and slightly higher clocks on the GTX, but aside from this, the rebrand didn't really bring anything new to the table. But NVIDIA wasn't satisfied yet. A little while later, NVIDIA re-released the 9800 GTX, this time as the 9800 GTX Plus. It's virtually the same as the 9800 GTX, but now it's built on TSMC's new 55nm node and has better clocks. But oh no, the GTX 280 is now launched, and it's brought with it a new naming scheme. So wouldn't it be great if NVIDIA took the 9800 GTX Plus and made it fit in by calling it the GTS 250? Because that's definitely going to solve the confusion, especially since it's now 2009 and the GTX 280 launched months ago.
If all of that was a lot to take in, I don't blame you. Consumers were very confused by this back then. Rebranding what is essentially the same product like 3 or 4 times obviously is just going to create a ton of confusion and mess. No idea why NVIDIA thought it was a good idea to do that, but they did. And to make things even worse, there are even more G92 derivatives that I didn't even mention because it would have made the video like 20 minutes long. Let's actually take a look at the cards we got here. So these are 2 NVIDIA GeForce GTS 250s. These are made by XFX and they have 512 megabytes of VRAM. In fact, one of these cards, and don't ask me which because I don't remember, was actually featured on the channel years ago, actually, when I cleaned it out, because it was very disgusting, some of the worst dust I've ever seen in a GPU before. And since I already had one GTS 250, I just went ahead and got another identical one. Now these aren't my first choice for a GTS 250. The cooler on them is quite cheap. It's all aluminum and there's really, well, there's just not a lot of it. So they are a little loud. In fact, might be louder than the system was before, maybe. I don't know. I don't have a sound meter or anything. It doesn't actually sound any louder than it did before, but yeah, these coolers are not great. The fans run kind of loud on them, so yeah, but I already had the one. I didn't really want to go out and buy two whole other cards, you know, some nice like EVGA ones or Asus ones or something, because that would have been like $40 versus like the 20-ish that I spent for just a second one, since I got this one or whatever one I had before for free like a long time ago, so. And yes, these are NVIDIA graphics cards made by XFX. XFX nowadays is well known for only making AMD Radeon GPUs, so making NVIDIA GPUs sounds strange, but back then they actually used to only make NVIDIA GPUs. If you're not that familiar with computer hardware of the time, XFX used to be very prominently an NVIDIA-only graphics card maker, and they actually made really high-quality GPUs. Maybe not so much these, but they're lower-end cards, so we'll give them a pass on that. Considering that these came out in 2009, this is actually very close to the end of NVIDIA's partnership with NVIDIA. This is actually right towards the end of NVIDIA's partnership with XFX. There was a whole big kind of fallout thing that happened in 2010. This is actually right towards the end of NVIDIA's partnership with XFX. Basically, in 2010, they kind of had this big falling out. XFX wanted to branch out into making AMD GPUs. NVIDIA being NVIDIA, they didn't exactly take this very well, so they struck them from their approved partner list. And XFX didn't quite immediately stop making NVIDIA GPUs. They kind of kept making some low-end cards. I think they went all the way up till like the GTX 600 series, making like the lower-end kind of cards, but they basically put all of their focus into making out AMD cards. The partnership effectively died in 2010, and there was no more high-end NVIDIA GPUs from XFX, which really sucked because they actually made pretty high-quality cards at that point. Modern XFX and their Radeon cards are a different topic, but yeah, it's unfortunate, but it's kind of cool. These are some of the last cards that they would have been making before that whole fallout happened. Remember, kids, NVIDIA was never a good company. They were just better at hiding it back then. So these are built on TSMC's 55nm process, and to make things even worse, not all GTS 250s are even 55nm. Some of them are 65nm 9800 GTX rebrands. Thanks, NVIDIA. So let's not focus on that anymore, because if we keep doing that, our heads are going to hurt even worse. So going from 90 nanometers on the 8800 GTX down to 55 nanometers on the GTS 250s, that should be a very significant power reduction. And not to mention that the GTS 250s are clocked a little higher. Sure, the core is built a little differently, but clock speeds are higher, so the performance should actually be a little better than what these could offer. These do have one big limitation compared to this. This has 768 megabytes of VRAM. These only have 512, and I would have loved to have bought 1 gigabyte GTS 250s, but again, I only had the one that was already a 512, so I kind of was stuck with that. It shouldn't really be a huge issue unless I'm going to be playing at very high resolutions like 1920 by 1200 and cranking up all the details, cranking up texture resolution and whatnot, but it's a little bit annoying, but it is what it is. These cards should also breathe a little better in the case. What my big issue with the 8800 GTX cooler is, well, one, it's not direct die. These are direct die cooling, so you don't have a heat spreader with thermal interface material that can dry out over time, and yeah, I don't want to delid these things. So it is a blower cooler, but not a ton of this air actually makes its way out the back. A lot of it makes its way out through these slots here, and of course that just dumps back into the case. For example, the bottom card would kind of blow exhaust into the power supply, and some of it would recirculate back into the card. This is not a great stock cooler design. These are while the actual coolers themselves are worse, they don't have any heat pipes, where that at least has one heat pipe and has some copper in it. But all the air is actually being exhausted out the rear bracket, so it's better in that aspect. It should bring the case temps down a little bit, and hopefully I won't have to crank the front fans up quite as high as I did, because those sound like jet engines when you crank them all the way up, so hopefully that helps.
The benchmarking will be pretty simple and straightforward. Cinebench R10 to test CPU performance, 3D Mark 06 for a synthetic load, and Crysis at high settings with no AA at 1680 by 1050 for an actual game comparison. We'll also take a look at power consumption in each test, measuring total system power draw from the wall. The QX6700 predictably performed very well in Cinebench, with strong single and multi-thread results. The stock E8600 at 3.33 of course performed far worse in the multi-threaded, but single-threaded actually saw about an 8% increase over the extreme. I was actually anticipating a smaller increase of closer to 3 to 4%, but at least in Cinebench the updated design seems to be more beneficial than I initially thought. In 3D Mark 06, the overall score actually decreases by a bit. While the GPUs are theoretically faster than the 8800s, the score is actually being brought down by the CPU. We can see by looking at the CPU score, the Duo is performing much worse than the Extreme. It appears the CPU test on here is capable of using more than 2 threads, thus the lower CPU score. And in Crysis, the CPU benchmark scored an average of 50 FPS on the later runs. It's worth noting that the canned Crysis benchmarks are always slower on the first run. If anyone knows why that is, I'd be interested to know, but I assume it's just because it's still loading in assets, but that's just a guess. With the E8600 and GTS 250s, the average goes up to 55 FPS, and in the GPU benchmark for Crysis, the old setup got 47 FPS, and the new setup an average of 53. But now for the moment I was really excited for. Overclocking the E8600. It turned out to be surprisingly easy. The motherboard seemed to have no issues going straight to a 1600 megatransfer FSB, and the CPU ended up being happy at 1.3 volts. It's worth noting that due to V-droop, the actual voltage getting to the CPU is only around 1.25 to 1.27 volts. This was before the days of load line calibration and better power delivery, so you often have to set the voltage higher than what is actually necessary to overcome this drop in voltage. And thankfully it's been completely stable as well. Over 12 hours of stress testing resulted in no issues. In Cinebench with the overclock, we're getting a very impressive score of 4400 for the single-threaded. That's over 1,000 points higher than the Extreme, and an impressive 20% improvement over the stock E8600. The overclock is also helping to close the gap in the multi-threaded score. The score in 3D Mark is also seeing a nice improvement, albeit with some unexpected behavior. The CPU score is higher, but nowhere close enough for it to beat the QX6700. So why is the score so much higher? If we look at the individual scores for SM 2.0 and 3.0, we can see those results are much higher after the overclock. I think what's happening here is that the GPUs were being bottlenecked by the CPU. The overclock allowed the GPUs to use more of their potential and achieve the higher score. I also think the CPU score isn't heavily factored into the overall total score, hence why going from the Extreme to the stock Duo only resulted in a small hit to the score. The fact that the GPUs were also performing better here probably helped as well. And with Crysis, we can see the CPU benchmark reach 61 FPS, and the GPU test gets bumped up to 59. Crysis really loves strong single-threaded performance, and we're definitely seeing that here. Now for the big moment I've been waiting for the most, the power consumption. The measurements I've used are the peak wattage reading drawn from the wall with my watt meter. Trying to average out the readings during a test would have been better and probably more representative of what the machines are actually drawing, but peak is way easier to figure out. Starting off with just idling at the desktop, the original setup consumed nearly 300 watts just doing nothing. Yeah, that's not great. But now the new setup is only consuming 183 watts at idle. This is exactly the type of improvement I wanted to see. Overclocked, the new setup pulled around 195 watts, It's a little worse, but I think the trade-off is more than worth it for the performance improvement. With all cores loaded up in Cinebench, the old setup drew 377 watts, the new stock setup was way down to just 218, and overclock that raised up to 228. 3D Mark 06 I drew results from the first 2 tests. The old setup peaked at 460 watts. The new setup at stock just 322 watts, and when overclocked, 346 watts. And in the GPU benchmark for Crysis, which seemed to make the system draw more power than the CPU benchmark, the old setup went up to a whopping 523 watts. The GTS 250's die shrink improvements are well displayed here. The stock new setup drew just 384, and with the CPU overclocked, that goes up to 396.
So all in all, I'm very happy with how the machine turned out. We've reduced the power consumption by a pretty significant amount, performance has gone up, and it still has basically the same spirit as the build did originally, just it's leaner and meaner, I guess. Unfortunately, I didn't really get the noise down any. It's still basically just as loud as it was before, but I can tolerate it. Gaming machines back then they were just loud. There was not a whole lot you could usually do. They were just loud. Unless you were water cooling, it was just kind of something you had to put up with. Do I miss the old setup any? Not really. I mean, it's, you know, the same spirit and everything. It's not really that noticeably different other than it doesn't make the room quite as hot, so that's, you know, a plus. It's basically better in every single way than the old one was, and I'm perfectly happy with that. If you want to build an XP machine, it makes way more sense to build a machine like this than the one I did before. So if you want to build an XP machine, this makes a lot more sense than what I did before, although I'd recommend probably going with a strong single GPU rather than a multi-GPU setup unless you just really want to try it SLI, which I don't blame you, it's very cool. But if you are gonna get GTS 250s though, I definitely recommend getting the 1 gig version. They are actually easier to find and they're more plentiful on eBay and they don't even cost more, so there's no reason to get a 512 meg version. Now, it was basically entirely smooth sailing, except I did encounter one hard system lockup when I was playing Half-Life 2. I'm guessing that was due to the CPU overclock, so I bumped the voltage up by a notch. Hasn't really been any big issues since then. Actually, it did crash one more time in Half-Life 2, but that gave out a different error, and the system seemed perfectly fine after that. I was able to boot the game back up, and it played perfectly fine, so it's weird that Half-Life 2 would cause issues like this, but I'm assuming that it was maybe a freak thing the first time, and the second time could have just been Half-Life 2 being Half-Life 2 because, well, I was playing the release version of it from 2004, which is already a little buggy as it is, so who can really say, but considering I've had no issues in anything else, I think the system is pretty stable. But I finally feel like I can actually use this computer now without roasting myself to death. You know, summer's coming up pretty quick here, and having this thing on for any significant amount of time, even just at idle, again, remember, idle at 300 watts is about what this system pulls under like a medium gaming load. So this is definitely a lot nicer to live with. I definitely don't regret doing what I did initially, going for the highest tier parts that I could possibly get for, you know, the time frame. I got to experience them and, you know, I got to deal with all the drawbacks, but, you know, it was fun while I did it, but this is just better and I can go to this and I'm still happy. That's what matters, really. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I know it's kind of a weird topic. It's not something that applies to most people because I don't think a lot of people had the exact setup that I did that, you know, you would then go and make it more efficient. It's just a weird thing that I wanted to do, but figured I might as well go ahead and document it. Oh, one more thing I forgot about. I can't use my cool hard 3-way SLI bridge anymore with this setup. I had to go for the single ribbon cable because that's all I had. This didn't actually like improve the bandwidth or anything, so there's not like a performance loss here, but for whatever reason, when I had this thing in, it caused constant video corruption issues and whatnot. I think one of the SLI fingers on one of these cards on the the leftmost one here was causing issues. I tried cleaning both of them and I just could not consistently get it to work, and I could only get it to work consistently with a ribbon cable, SLI connector on the second connectors. Don't know why, it's an annoying thing, but I couldn't use this anymore, so that's sad. Doesn't look as cool now, but oh well. But if you guys were interested in this, I'd recommend checking out the original video I did for Windows XP's 20th anniversary when I built this machine. That was way back in 2021. Geez, that's coming up on 3 years now. But yeah, check that video out if you want to see more of this machine. I have some other videos about it too, where I swapped it around in cases and did other stuff if you want to find out about that. But yeah, thank you guys for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.